He was the most terrifying man in Chicago. She cleaned his floors for minimum wage. He had 23 professionals, $4 million, and every resource power could buy, yet his young son hadn't spoken a word in 8 months. She had nothing. No money, no family, no escape, only a broken heart and a secret language she had learned for the daughter she had buried. No one expected it. No one could have predicted that the answer to his prayer would be kneeling on his marble floor. What happened next didn't just restore a child's voice. It rebuilt two broken souls from the roots and changed everything. This channel tells stories of mafia bosses, unexpected love, and the quiet, unbreakable power of family, a family that is chosen, not given. Because ultimately, no amount of power or money can fill an empty house. Only love can. And if this story touches your heart as it touched ours, hit the like button, leave a comment, letting us know what moved you most, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you don't miss any more stories like this.
Imagine that. The whole room was buzzing, of course. But he wasn't looking at them. He told me later he was just thinking of his wife, Isabella, who they'd buried 8 months before. He was searching for a miracle from a doctor or a genius, never guessing that the answer to his prayer was on her knees in his own home, scrubbing his floors. That was me. A 27-year-old woman with scars on her back and not a dime to my name, carrying a hurt in my heart that was just as deep as his. A mother's pain. While he was making that shocking offer, I was 20 miles away in a greasy spoon diner, counting my tips for the third time. $47.63. My hands were so raw from washing dishes, they shook as I tried to smooth out the bills on that sticky counter. The lights above just flickered and hummed. I was 27, but honey, the woman I saw reflected in that greasy window looked closer to 40. Rent was $400, due in 3 days. I had 47. I shoved the money in my pocket and headed out back into the alley. That March wind just sliced right through you. I was walking home, my old sneakers splashing through the slush, when I smelled it, that mix of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne. Two men stepped out from behind a dumpster, blocking my way. The only light came from the tips of their cigarettes. The bigger one grunted my name, his voice like rocks grinding together. Tony Marcello sends his regards. My blood ran cold. I told him I need more time, I whispered, trying to back away. I'm working 3 jobs. I swear I can pay. The first punch landed right in my stomach, folding me in half. The second split my lip, and all I could taste was blood. $50,000. The smaller one snarled, twisting his hand in my hair and pulling my head back. 2 months, or we find other ways to get our money. He threw me against the brick wall, and my head hit so hard I saw stars. Your husband made a bad bet, sweetheart, he said, and now you're the one who pays. They just left me there, crumpled in a heap like a piece of trash. I think I laid in that alley for an hour, maybe more, just staring up at the sliver of sky between the buildings. No stars. You never saw stars in the South Side. It took everything I had, but I finally pulled myself up and limped the last few blocks home. My apartment was in a building that should have been torn down, and I had to climb 4 flights of stairs that groaned with every step. The place was just one room, really, with a mattress on the floor and a radiator that rattled but never gave off any heat. But it had the one thing that mattered to me. On a little crate I used as a nightstand, there was a picture in a cheap frame. It was a little girl with a tangle of golden hair and the bluest eyes, giving the camera this big, gap-toothed smile. Next to it was a tiny bracelet made of pink and purple beads. My Lily. I just collapsed onto the mattress, hugging that picture to my chest, and all the memories came flooding back. The foster homes. The first one where they'd lock me in a closet. The second, where a man's belt wasn't just for his pants. The third, where I learned that the safest thing you could be was quiet. I remember fighting my way out of that life, getting scholarships, working my way through college to learn sign language, helping kids who couldn't speak find their voice. I remembered meeting Marcus and believing all his pretty lies. And then I remembered my Lily, born with a little heart that was too weak for this world. She was 3 when the doctor said she needed an operation that cost $200,000, an operation the insurance company wouldn't touch. I remember holding her in my arms in that hospital room, watching the line on the monitor go flat, just screaming for a help that never came. And Marcus, my husband, he disappeared that same night, left me with nothing but a mountain of his gambling debts. That was 2 years before. I'd been slowly dying inside ever since. My phone buzzed on the floor. I almost didn't look, but I did. It was a job alert I'd signed up for ages ago. Housekeeper needed for Gold Coast Estate, high salary, absolute discretion required. The Gold Coast. That was a different world, full of old money and new power. I stared at that notification, then at the bruises on my arms, and then at my daughter's picture. Well, I whispered to her sweet, smiling face, it's either die slow or die fast. At least this way, I'll get a good meal first, right, baby girl? And I hit apply. 3 days after that man's desperate plea, I was standing at the iron gates of the Castellano mansion, my heart hammering like it wanted out of my chest. I'd never seen a place like it. It took up a whole city block, it seemed, with high walls and cameras watching your every move. The driveway wound through these perfect gardens with marble statues that looked like ghosts in the gray morning light. The house itself looked more like a palace, all white stone and windows that glittered. I clutched my old purse, suddenly feeling every single frayed thread in my jacket. I'd tried to cover the bruise on my cheek, but the cheap makeup was already cracking. A guard who looked like he was carved from stone came up to me. "Eleanor Morgan," I said. "I'm here about the housekeeper job." He looked at a tablet, then nodded to a woman guard. She gave me a thorough pat-down, checking my bag, my pockets, making me feel like a common criminal. I just stood there and took it, swallowing what was left of my pride. "Follow me," the first guard said. That walk to the front door felt like it took a year. I remember counting my steps just to stay calm, 117 from the gate to the door. Inside, it literally took my breath away. The floors were polished marble, and a chandelier the size of a small car dripped with crystals. A huge curved staircase swept up to the next floor. But something felt off. For all its beauty, it was cold. It felt like a museum, not a home. There were no family pictures, no little signs of life, no proof that anyone had ever been happy there. The guard led me into a sitting room where a woman was waiting. She was probably around 60, with her silver hair in a tight bun and eyes that could chip ice. She wore a simple black dress and sat so straight it made my back hurt just looking at her. "Sit," she said. It wasn't a request. I sat. "I am Margaret Crawford," she said. "You will call me Mrs. Crawford. I run this household. You're hired, you'll be reporting directly to me." She slid a folder across the desk. "Eleanor Morgan, 27. Your history shows waitressing, cleaning services, and some factory work. No police record, no family." I remember flinching inside when she said those last 2 words, but I kept my face like stone. "Why do you want this job?" she asked. "I need the money." It was the honest-to-God truth. Mrs. Crawford's eyes, sharp as needles, narrowed on me. "Everyone needs money. Why this job? You've certainly heard the stories about this house." "I hear all sorts of things," I told her, choosing my words carefully. "I've learned not to pay them much mind." Something shifted in her expression then. Maybe approval, or just a lack of disgust. "Very well," she said. "The rules. First, you will have no interaction with the young master. None at all. You won't speak to him, look at him, or even admit he exists. Understood?" I nodded. "Second, you are never to ask about Mr. Castellano's business. You'll see things. You'll hear things. You'll forget them instantly. Another nod from me. Third, what happens in this home stays in this home. Not a single word to anyone. If you break this rule, the consequences will be severe. She leaned forward then, her voice low. Do you have any idea what severe means here, Miss Morgan? I looked right back at her. I understand. She sized me up for what felt like an eternity, then stood. Follow me. The tour of that place, honey, it took nearly an hour. 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a library that looked bigger than my old apartment building. Every room was more stunning than the last, but they were all cold, lifeless. As we got to the second floor, Mrs. Crawford seemed to hurry past a certain door at the end of the hall, but it wasn't quite shut. There was a little gap, maybe 2 inches, with a sliver of light spilling out. And in that sliver, I saw him. A little boy on a window seat, so perfectly still, hugging a worn-out teddy bear. He was staring down at the garden, but his eyes weren't really seeing it. They were empty, you know, like windows in a house where all the lights have been turned off. I knew those eyes. I'd seen them once before, in another sweet face, in another life. In Lily's final days, when she was too weak to smile anymore, too tired to cry, my chest just seized up so tight I couldn't get a breath in. Miss Morgan. Mrs. Crawford's voice was like a whip cracking, and it brought me back. I realized I'd stopped walking, my hand pressed right over my heart. Coming, I whispered. I made myself move, made myself follow, but that little boy's face was burned into my memory. After I buried Lily, kneeling by her little grave in the pouring rain, I swore I'd never let my heart break for another child. The pain was just too much to bear. I'd built walls around myself so high no one could get in. But looking into those empty eyes, eyes that looked so much like my daughter's at the end, I felt those walls start to crack. That night, long after the house went still, Dominic Castellano's car slipped through the gates. He was sitting in the back, I learned later, all tensed up. A meeting he'd had went badly. Rivals saw an opening, smelled weakness. His announcement had made him a target, and in his line of work, that was a death sentence. His man, Vincent Romano, met him at the door. 437 responses, Vincent told him. 90% are fakes, psychics, healers, people promising miracles. He took a breath. We also found 6 professional hitters pretending to be specialists. They thought they could use the boy to get to you. Dominic stopped right there on the stairs. Handled? He asked. Handled. He didn't say another word, just went up. Lucas's room was dark, with just a little nightlight glowing. The boy was in bed, his eyes wide open, just staring up at the ceiling. His bear, Mr. Buttons, was tucked right under his chin. His father sat on the bed. Hey, buddy, Daddy's home. Nothing. Remember how you used to fake those snores when I talked about work? Mommy would laugh so hard. His voice just broke. But Lucas kept staring. Dominic reached out and touched his son's cheek. The boy was warm, alive, but it was like he wasn't there anymore, lost somewhere his father couldn't go. Lucas, please, he begged. Just look at me. But the boy's gaze stayed on the ceiling, as empty as ever. The memories must have been flooding back. His wife, Isabella, in the kitchen with a dab of flour on her nose, showing Lucas how to make pancakes. Lucas singing some song he'd made up. Daddy is strong, Daddy is tall, Daddy will catch me if I fall. Isabella would be filming, just laughing, so full of life. He'd sworn he would protect them from everything, but he couldn't protect her from her own heart. She'd collapsed right there in front of Lucas. A hidden defect, the doctors called it. A ticking time bomb. By the time he got there, it was too late, and his son hadn't said a word since. Dominic picked up Mr. Buttons, holding the little bear to his chest. You know, it still had a faint smell of her perfume. I failed you, Isabella, he whispered into the dark. I couldn't save you, and now I'm losing him too. Tears ran down his face, the most feared man in Chicago, all alone, crying and holding a teddy bear. A soft knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Crawford. "Sir, the new housekeeper is settled in. Her background check was fine. Nothing remarkable." Dominic just wiped his face. "Fine. Make sure she knows the rules." "Yes, sir." She left as quietly as she came. He had no idea that 3 floors below, the unremarkable girl was lying in her own narrow bed, clutching a faded photo of a little girl with golden hair. He didn't know my tears were falling with the same rhythm as his. 2 broken souls, grieving in the dark, with no idea that our lives were already starting to twist together. A week after I started, I'd pretty much mastered the art of being invisible. I floated through that house like a ghost, just cleaning, never saying a word, making myself as small as possible. I learned the whole routine of the place. Nicole, the nanny, took Lucas to his therapy every morning at 9. Dominic was gone by sunrise and back long after sunset. Mrs. Crawford prowled the halls like a prison warden, her eyes missing nothing. And through it all, Lucas just drifted, a tiny little phantom, silent and completely out of reach. I'd watch him out of the corner of my eye. The way he could walk without a single sound. How he'd sit for hours just staring. And how he always clutched that little bear, Mr. Buttons, like it was the only thing keeping him from floating away. I kept telling my heart to stay out of it. I was there for a paycheck, plain and simple. But every time I saw those empty eyes, my chest would ache with a feeling I knew all too well. One Tuesday, I was polishing the big banister upstairs when I felt it. Feeling like someone was right behind me, I turned around, and there was Lucas, standing just a few feet away, watching me. My heart just stopped cold. Up close, he seemed even smaller, so pale with dark smudges under his eyes. He was holding Mr. Buttons tight, and his eyes, those awful, hollow eyes, were locked on me. I opened my mouth, though I had no idea what I was going to say. "Lucas." Nicole's sharp voice came from down the hall. She strode over, grabbed his little shoulder, and pulled him back. "What did I tell you about wandering off?" she snapped at him. Then her cold eyes landed on me. "And you are not to engage with him. Ever. Do you understand?" I was just... Understood. I dropped my eyes to the floor. Yes. Nicole led him away, but just for a second, right before he turned the corner, he looked back at me. And there was something in that look, honey, that just stole my breath. Later that afternoon, while dusting the living room, I found it. A drawer had been left open a crack. Inside, under a pile of old papers, was a silver picture frame. It was a woman with dark hair and such kind eyes, laughing right at the camera. My blood turned to ice. I knew that face. 2 years earlier, at the hospital, on the worst night of my whole life. Lily's little heart was giving out. I was begging, screaming for someone to help her. And a doctor came in. A beautiful woman with tired, gentle eyes. "I am so sorry," she'd said, with tears just streaming down her own face. "The surgery she needs. The hospital won't approve it without payment up front. I've tried everything. I'm so sorry. I can't do anything else." For the longest time, I hated that woman. I blamed her, and the hospital, and the whole world for Lily's death. Isabella Castellano. The name on the photograph trembled in my hands. The woman who couldn't save my little girl was the same woman whose death had silenced her own little boy. "What are you doing?" I spun around. It was Dominic, standing in the doorway, his face impossible to read. His gaze went from me to the picture frame in my hands. "I was cleaning," I said, putting it back quickly. "I found this in the drawer." I didn't mean to pry. That was my wife. The words just hung in the air between us. "I know," I whispered. And I don't think he understood then just how true that was. Couldn't help myself. I remember Dominic's eyes getting so sharp. "You knew her?" he asked. "No," I said quickly. I just saw he looked like her. A long, heavy quiet hung between us then. He just stared at me, so intensely I felt like I needed to run. Then he asked out of nowhere, "Do you have children?" Oh, that question hit me like a ton of bricks. I did, I heard myself whisper. Once. Something in his face changed then. Just for a second, that icy wall around him cracked, and I saw something raw underneath. "What happened?" he asked. "She died." The silence that came back was even heavier. But he looked at me differently after that. I wasn't just staff, not a piece of furniture anymore. I was someone who knew that silent, awful language of loss. I had to turn and walk away. My legs felt like jelly. I could feel him watching me all the way down the hall, long after I was out of sight. I didn't find out until much later that it was the first time in 8 months he'd looked at anyone with anything more than a blank stare. The very next day, the whole mansion was just buzzing. Black cars filled the driveway, and people in fancy suits were carrying briefcases right through the front door. Guards were at every door, checking IDs. I remember pressing myself flat against the wall with my mop, trying to stay invisible like always. Dr. Samuel Hayes was leading the whole group. He was a tall, silver-haired man who walked like he'd never known a day of doubt in his life. Behind him were all sorts of specialists, a child psychologist, a speech therapist, even a neurologist, with assistants carrying strange equipment. They were the best team in the country. I overheard Mrs. Crawford telling someone Mr. Castellano had flown them in from Boston that morning. They took Lucas into the library, which they'd turned into some kind of medical room. I watched from the hall as Nicole led the poor boy inside. He was like a little sleepwalker. His teddy, Mr. Buttons, just dragging on the floor behind him. Then the door shut. For 3 hours, sweetheart, I cleaned that same little piece of hallway, again and again, just trying to hear anything. The voices would rise and fall. They started out calm, then you could hear the frustration creeping in. I heard the sounds of tools, papers rustling, and that fake cheerful voice adults use on a child who just isn't there to give one. At last, the doors swung open. Dr. Hayes came out first, and you could see that confidence of his was gone. The others followed, and the looks they gave each other just screamed failure. Little Lucas came out last, his face exactly the same, his eyes just as empty. It was as if the whole thing never happened, as if nothing could ever touch him again. Dominic rushed out of his study, and for a moment I saw this tiny spark of hope in his eyes. "Well?" he demanded. Dr. Hayes cleared his throat. "Mr. Castellano, I promise you, we used every method we have." He started listing things, cognitive techniques, play therapy. "The results," Dominic snapped, cutting him right off. "Just give me the results." The doctor took a breath. "Physically, your son is perfectly fine. His vocal cords work, his brain scans are clear. This is purely psychological." He paused for a moment. "Lucas has sealed himself away inside a fortress, and I'm afraid nothing we have can break through." The quiet that followed was the kind that chokes you. "Get out," Dominic said, his voice low and dangerous. "Mr. Castellano, if you'd just—" "I said, get out," his voice boomed through the marble halls. "All of you, now." That whole team just scrambled to get their things and leave. Vincent came to Dominic's side, his face full of worry. "Boss, you've got to calm down. The Moretti family is watching. If they see you like this—" "I don't care about the Morettis." Just then, the front door opened again, and in swept a woman. She must have been 65, all in black silk, with perfect silver hair and diamonds sparkling at her neck. Her face was beautiful but cold, like it was carved from the same hard stone as her son's. "Dominic," his mother, Catherine Castellano, said. Her voice was like ice. "We need to talk." "Not now, mother." "Yes, now." She shot a disgusted look at the doctors leaving. "Another failure, I take it. How many does that make? 20? 30? Dominic's jaw got so tight I thought it would break. "This ridiculous announcement of yours has made us a laughingstock," she went on. The other families are snickering. Our enemies can smell weakness. You're ruining everything your father built. I am trying to save my son. By offering half your fortune to any quack who says they can help him? Catherine stepped right up to him. You're thinking with your heart, Dominic. Your father never made that mistake. My father never lost his wife. Dominic's voice cracked on that last word. I've already lost Isabella. I will not lose Lucas, too. They just stood there staring at each other, a mother and son, neither one giving an inch. From the hallway, I saw it all. I watched Nicole lead Lucas upstairs, his poor little shoulders just slumped. I saw how all those experts had poked and tested him like he was some broken toy. It struck me then that not one of them had just sat with him, just tried to be with him in his silence. I thought of Lily's last days, how she'd gotten too weak to speak, but her hands could still talk, making the signs I had taught her. Mama, she had signed, her little fingers trembling. Love. My eyes started to burn. Later that night, I was mopping upstairs when I heard it. A soft sound coming from Lucas's room. It was broken, like someone trying not to make a noise. I crept closer, my heart just pounding. Through the crack in the door, I saw Dominic. He was kneeling by his son's bed, his big shoulders shaking. His face was buried in the blankets, and the noises he was making weren't from a powerful man. They were the sounds of a father who had lost everything. I backed away without a sound, the tears finally rolling down my own face. The next morning, you would have thought nothing had happened. The specialists were gone, their equipment packed up. Mrs. Crawford was barking orders like she always did, and the staff were moving like little ants. Nobody mentioned the failed doctors. Nobody talked about the crying some of us might have heard in the night. I was dusting the living room, trying to keep my mind on my work. But all I could see was Dominic on his knees, his shoulders shaking. I knew that kind of grief, the kind that waits for the dark when it thinks no one can see. A tiny noise made me turn my head. It was Lucas, standing in the doorway, still as a statue. Mr. Buttons was hanging from his hand, the bear's little paw almost on the floor. And then it slipped. The bear just fell to the marble with a soft little thud. Lucas just stared down at it, his face empty. He didn't move to pick it up. He didn't move at all. It was like bending over was more effort than he had in his whole body. I looked around real quick. The hallway was empty. Nicole was nowhere to be seen. I knew the rules. Don't talk to him. Don't touch him. Keep my head down or I'd be out the door. But looking at that little boy, standing over his only friend with those hollow eyes, I just couldn't do it. Slowly, I put my duster down and walked toward him. I knelt right in front of him, to be at his level, and gently picked up Mr. Buttons. But instead of just giving it back, I held the bear in one hand and lifted my other. My fingers moved in a way I knew better than my own name, a sign I'd made 1,000 times. Friend, I whispered, making the sign. This means friend. Lucas's eyes flickered. It was the first time, the very first time, I had seen a real spark in them. He was staring at my hands with a focus that made my heart jump. I made the sign again, very slowly. Lucas just watched, tilting his head a little. And for one tiny, wonderful second, there was a light in his eyes. And then it was gone. But it had been there. I saw it. Lucas! Nicole's voice was like a whip cracking, shattering the moment. The nanny came charging down the hall, her face all twisted up. What in the world do you think you're doing? She snarled, grabbing Lucas's arm and yanking him away from me. You were told to keep away from him. He dropped his bear, I said, getting to my feet. I was just giving it back. I saw what you were doing with your hands. Her eyes narrowed at me. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm reporting this to Mrs. Crawford. She dragged Lucas off before I could say another word, but he looked back at me. You know, just once over his shoulder. And in that one look, I saw something I knew so well. It was the look of a soul trapped behind glass, just desperate for a way out. That night, in my little room, I sat on my bed holding Lily's picture. My daughter was smiling at me, forever 3 years old. That blonde hair, those blue eyes, that little gap in her teeth that could make any day brighter. The memories just came rushing in. Lily in that hospital bed, too frail to talk. Her little body was giving out, but her hands, honey, her hands never stopped. I had taught her sign language since she was a baby. It was our own secret world. And in those last days, when she couldn't speak, it was all we had. It was the only way we could ever really talk. Mama, Lily had signed, her little fingers working so hard. Love. You know, those were the last words I ever got from her. Not from her mouth, but from her hands. I was holding her picture so tightly, just crying my eyes out. Should Mama help that little boy, my sweet girl? I whispered to no one. The room was silent, but I swear, deep in my soul, I heard her laugh. My mind was made up right then. I was going to help Lucas. I would teach him the language that Lily and I shared, even if it cost me that job, even if I lost everything. What I didn't realize was, way up on the third floor, a guard was watching the security tapes. He stopped the video on me, a cleaning lady kneeling in front of the boss's son, making these strange shapes with my hands. He picked up the phone to call Vincent. In the days after, our little secret game began. I'd wait until my shift took me to Lucas's room. As soon as Nicole went for her lunch and the halls were quiet, I'd slip a little drawing under his pillow. The first one showed the sign for friend, just simple lines showing how to link your fingers. I wrote the word next to it. The next day, when I came in to fix his bed, the paper was there, but he'd added something. Next to my sign, Lucas had drawn a tiny teddy bear with crayon button eyes. He called him Mr. Buttons, and he was standing right by the word friend. Oh, my heart just about melted. He was answering me, you see, through his own quiet world. Lucas was reaching out. I left him another note that day. The sign for water this time. Just 3 fingers tapping on the chin. The next morning, I found his little drawing. He'd copied my sign perfectly, a little hand at a chin with drops of water falling down. Our secret conversation kept going. Eat, a hand moving to the mouth. Sleep, 2 palms together by a tilted cheek. Happy, a hand brushing up over the chest. Every day, a new sign from me. Every day, a new drawing from him. Sometimes he added his own little pictures, a dinner plate, a bed with little stars, a big smiling sun. We never said a word out loud. We never even saw each other during our little exchanges. But a connection was growing between us, a little thread made of paper, crayons, and a whole lot of hope. I started seeing little things change when I'd catch a glimpse of him around that big house. His shoulders didn't seem so slumped. His eyes, they were still quiet, but now and then a little spark of curiosity would flicker. But I wasn't the only one seeing things. Nicole started watching Lucas, her eyes full of suspicion. The boy was making odd movements with his hands, little gestures that were just gibberish to her, but you could tell he was doing them on purpose. She found him once by the window, his fingers making shapes in the air, like he was practicing. "What are you doing?" she snapped. Lucas just dropped his hands, and that blank look came right back over his face. Nicole didn't say anything else, but I could see the suspicion in her eyes. The moment everything nearly fell apart was a Thursday. Nicole had left her phone in Lucas's room and went back for it. She just threw the door open without a knock. And there was Lucas on the floor, with Mr. Buttons sitting right in front of him, and his little hands were making the sign for friend. He was showing his teddy bear. Nicole just stood there in the doorway, watching him do it again and again, his lips moving without a sound, like he was trying to remember. "What is that?" she demanded. "Where did you learn to do that?" Lucas froze, and his hands just fell. That little bit of light in his eyes just went out, replaced by that familiar emptiness. But Nicole had seen all she needed to. An hour later, she was in Mrs. Crawford's office, whispering, 2 hours after that, Mrs. Crawford was on the line with Vincent. And by that evening, Vincent was standing in front of Dominic, holding a tablet, showing him the security footage from 3 days earlier. There I was, the cleaning woman, kneeling and making signs with my hands. "The new housekeeper," Vincent said. "She's doing something with Lucas. We aren't sure what, but Nicole says the boy's been acting strange." Dominic just watched the video, his face was like stone. "Bring her to me," was all he said. The knock on my door came at 9 that night. I was just getting ready for bed when it rattled the whole frame. 2 guards were in the hall, their faces grim. "Mr. Castellano will see you now." They walked me through parts of that house I'd never seen, upstairs I had never used. The hallways got dimmer, and the air felt thick. They finally stopped at a huge oak door. One of them knocked twice and then just pushed it open. The room inside was dark, except for one lamp on a giant desk. The shadows were so deep, and 2 more guards stood against the walls. Behind the desk sat Dominic Castellano, his eyes glinting in the light like a wolf's in the dark. "Close the door," he said, his voice quiet. The door clicked shut behind me, and it sounded like a coffin closing. "We need to have a talk, Miss Morgan." I just stood there, my heart banging against my ribs. I had a terrible feeling this might be the last conversation I ever had with anyone. I stood in front of Dominic, my heart just pounding, and the silence in that room was so heavy you could feel it. The guards were like statues against the walls, just staring ahead, their hands ready. That one lamp threw these long, dancing shadows across Dominic's face, making him look less like a person and more like something ancient and powerful. "What were you doing with my son?" His voice was so calm and low, which was 1,000 times scarier than if he had screamed. My mind was just spinning. I could lie, I thought. Tell him it was just a silly game. Nothing at all. I could beg him, tell him I didn't know any better. But when I looked into his eyes, underneath all that cold anger, I saw desperation. It was the same look I had when I was holding Lily in the hospital, praying for a miracle I knew wouldn't come. So, I decided on the truth. I was teaching him sign language. His face didn't change one bit. Why? Because I used to be a sign language specialist. I took a shaky breath. Before I started cleaning houses, I worked with children who had been through so much trauma they couldn't speak. I helped them find another way to tell their story. "You lied on your application. I omitted some things. I needed the job. I didn't think my old life mattered. Everything matters in my house." Dominic leaned forward. His eyes locked on mine. "Why my son?" he asked, and his voice was cold steel. "What is it you want from him?" "Nothing." I remember my own voice shaking. I saw him drop his bear and he just stood there, like he didn't even have the energy to bend down. I saw how empty his eyes were. Oh, the tears were stinging then. "I knew that look," I told him, "because I saw it in my own little girl, right before she was gone." Something in his face just broke for a second. The hardness flickered. "Your daughter, Lily," he said, and her name sounded like a whisper. "She was only 3. She was born with a bad heart. We didn't have the money for the operation." My voice gave out completely then. "She passed away in my arms at the hospital. The whole room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop." "The same," Dominic breathed. "The same as Isabella." "Yes," I said, wiping my eyes with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. "And there's something else. Your wife, she was there that night. She was the doctor who tried to save my Lily." He went completely white. "She couldn't do anything for us," I went on. "The hospital wouldn't do the surgery unless we paid. But she really tried. She fought for her." I could barely speak above a whisper. "She cried when she told me there was nothing else she could do." For years I was so angry with her. I needed someone to blame for Lily's death, but now I see it clearly. It wasn't her. It was the whole situation. It was everything but that woman who wept with me for my child. I remember Dominic gripping the side of his desk, his knuckles turning pure white. Isabella never said a word, he said, his voice all gravelly. She carried all the children she fought for and couldn't save, and she never told me. She was a good woman, I said, my voice soft. And her little boy is still here. He's still fighting, even if he doesn't realize it. He looked up at me, his eyes just raw with pain. The doctors all say there's nothing they can do, he told me. They say it's in his head, that he's built these walls around himself. He has, I agreed. But every wall can have a door. I took a step closer, my fear just melting away. Lucas isn't broken. He's just stuck. His voice is trapped by what he went through. But sign language can give him a different way out, a way to tell you things he can't say. How can you be so sure this will work? He asked. Because I taught my own daughter to sign when she got too weak to talk. In her final moments, she wasn't crying. She smiled at me. She signed, "Mama loves you," and then she closed her eyes. Tears were just streaming down my face then. Lucas has so much he needs to say. He just needs someone to show him where the door is. Dominic just sat there for the longest time, not moving a muscle. I could see the muscles in his jaw working, his hands clenching and unclenching on that big desk. Then, ever so slowly, he stood up. He walked all the way around that desk, and he knelt down right in front of me. Imagine that. The most feared man in all of Chicago, on his knees to a cleaning lady, looking up at me with tears in his eyes. "Please," he whispered, "help my son." Everything was different after that. By the next morning, Dominic had given new orders. I wasn't the housekeeper anymore. I was Lucas's personal communication specialist, if you can believe that. I was given a private room right in the family's part of the mansion. Nicole was sent off to work at another house. No explanation given. Miss Crawford heard the news with her lips pursed so tight they nearly disappeared, but she didn't say a word against it. Vincent just gave a little nod, but I saw the way his eyes lingered on me, somewhere between curious and a warning. The real fireworks came from Catherine. She showed up the next afternoon without calling, her heels making an angry sound on the marble floors. I could hear the shouting 2 rooms away. "A cleaning woman is teaching my grandson?" Catherine's voice was so sharp it could have shattered glass. "Have you lost your mind entirely, Dominic? She's qualified. She scrubs toilets for a living. She also has a degree in sign language and has worked with traumatized children for years." Dominic's voice was so calm it was spooky. "Do you have a better idea, Mother? Because 23 specialists have already failed. 23 so-called experts with their fancy titles and their expensive methods. Not a single one of them could get through to Lucas. She did. This is beneath our family, beneath our name. Our family name won't mean a thing if my son stays a ghost." Dominic's voice turned to steel. "This conversation is over." Catherine stormed out a few minutes later. She passed me in the hall and gave me a look that was pure poison. Her silence was louder than any shout, but I didn't even blink. I'd stared down far worse than some grumpy old matriarch. Our first official lesson started that afternoon. Lucas was sitting on the floor in the playroom, clutching his teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, to his chest. His eyes were so wary, watching me like a little cornered animal. I sat down across from him, cross-legged, with my hands on my knees. "Hi, Lucas," I said very gently. "Do you remember the notes we passed? The pictures?" He didn't answer, but I saw his little hands loosen their grip on Mr. Buttons just a tiny bit. "Today, I thought we could learn some new signs, not with paper, but with our hands." I held up my right hand very slowly. "This means water." I showed him the sign, tapping my chin with 3 fingers. Lucas just watched me, so intently. "Wanna try?" For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Then, so slowly, Lucas lifted his own little hand. His fingers were a bit clumsy, but he tapped his chin. My heart just about leaped out of my chest. "Perfect," I whispered. "That was absolutely perfect." We kept at it for an hour. Water, eat, sleep, happy, sad. He picked up each new sign faster than the one before. He was like a little sponge, his hands getting more and more sure of themselves. And his eyes, they started to change. That empty look was still there, but behind it a little spark had appeared, a tiny little flame trying its best to grow. Outside the playroom, Dominic was watching through a crack in the door. He saw his son's hands moving with purpose for the first time in 8 months. He saw that blank stare replaced with focus. He saw the ghost of the boy Lucas once was, reaching out from all that silence. Tears just rolled down his cheeks, and he didn't even try to wipe them away. That evening, long after Lucas was asleep, I found Dominic waiting for me in the library. "Teach me," he said, just like that. "The signs," he clarified. "I want to learn them. I want to be able to talk to my son." I just nodded and pointed to a chair across from me at a small table. I started him with the very basics, the same signs I had taught Lucas that day. Water, eat, sleep. Dominic's hands, they were so large and calloused, built for a much rougher world. He fumbled with the movements, his fingers seeming so clumsy and unsure. It was almost funny, seeing this powerful man struggle with something a little boy had learned in minutes. But he never gave up. "Like this," I said, and I reached out to gently fix his fingers. "Your thumb needs to be on your chin, not your cheek." My hand just barely brushed against his. We both froze. It couldn't have been more than a second, but something shifted in the air between us. Something neither of us was ready to put a name to. Dominic cleared his throat and tried the sign again, getting it right this time. "Good," I said, pulling my hand away. We practiced like that, in silence, for another hour. The whole room felt charged with things we weren't saying. Finally, Dominic put his hands down on the table. "Do you think everyone deserves a second chance?" he asked so quietly, his eyes searching my face. I looked right back at him. "I believe everyone deserves to be loved," I told him. "Even the bosses of the Mafia." The next 2 weeks passed in this quiet rhythm of progress. Lucas was learning new signs every single day. He went from single words to little phrases. He could ask for a drink, point to what he wanted to eat, sign that he was tired. He even started to show his feelings. One afternoon, right in the middle of our lesson, Lucas just stopped. His little hands made a sign I'd taught him a few days before. "Sad," he signed. Then he pointed to a picture of Isabella on a shelf. "You miss your mommy?" I signed back to him. He nodded, his eyes getting all shiny with tears. It was the first time in 8 long months that he had communicated anything about his mother. I pulled him in for a hug, and for just a second, his whole body just relaxed into mine. It was happening. Slowly and with a lot of pain, but it was real. Dominic watched as many sessions as he could. He would practice the signs by himself late into the night, his rough hands becoming more graceful as the days went by. Sometimes he'd even join our lessons, sitting on the floor with Lucas, a father and son learning a new language together. And somewhere in all that, my evening lessons with him became something else. We would talk after Lucas was in bed. We talked about silly things, and we talked about big things, about loss and grief, and the funny ways life brings people together. Our talks got longer every night, and the space between us seemed to get smaller and smaller. We never said what was happening, what was growing between us. We didn't have to. But then, of course, the real world came knocking. Vincent showed up in Dominic's study one morning, and his face was grim. "We've got a problem, boss," he said. Dominic looked up from his work. "What kind of problem?" "Someone's been asking around about the Morgan woman," Vincent told him. "Digging into her past, where she used to live, where she worked." He took a breath. Tony Marcello. That name just hung in the room. "The loan shark from the South Side," Dominic said, his voice flat. "Her husband owed him money." 50,000, Vincent confirmed. "Marcello's been trying to find her ever since she vanished." Vincent's jaw was tight. "He knows she's working here now." Dominic's face didn't change, but his eyes, they got hard, turned ice cold. You know, that room suddenly felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. I learned later he'd doubled the guards around me, told them he wanted eyes on every door. Nobody was to get near me without his say-so. Vincent, his right-hand man, apparently asked him why. He just said, "She is mine." Sharp as a razor, I was told. No one touches what is mine. Vincent was smart enough to drop it. But that night, honey, I made a silly, foolish mistake. I'd left a few things at my old place, some clothes I didn't care about, but also a spare photo of Lily I'd tucked away. I hadn't meant to leave her picture behind, and the thought of it there all alone just ate at me. I didn't tell a soul. I just slipped out after dark, hopped in a taxi to the south side, figuring I'd be in and out. Who would even know? Oh, I was so wrong. They were waiting for me inside. Two men, the very same ones from before. They'd trashed the place. The mattress was ripped to shreds, the walls covered in spray-painted threats. Everything I owned was broken and scattered. "Hello again, Eleanor," the bigger one said, and cracked his knuckles. I didn't even have a chance to scream. The beating was just methodical. They were professionals, I guess. They knew how to hurt you the most without breaking anything permanently. 2 weeks, the smaller one hissed right next to my ear while I was curled up on the floor. "Pay up, or next time we start cutting things off." Before they walked out, the big one saw something shiny on the floor. It was the little bracelet I must have dropped. Pink and purple beads, lilies. He picked it up, looked it over, and then slid it into his pocket with this awful grin. "Consider this interest. They just left me there, a mess of blood and bruises in the wreck of my old life. I managed to crawl to where Lily's photo had landed. It was torn right in half, my daughter's sweet, smiling face split in two. I just held the pieces to my chest and cried. The bracelet was gone. The very last piece of her I had was gone. Of course, I had no idea that Dominic had put me under surveillance the second Vincent gave him that warning. I didn't know a camera across the street had seen the whole thing, and I certainly didn't know that miles away, in his dark office, Dominic Castellano was watching it all, his hands shaking with a rage so cold it could freeze fire, the iron fist, they called him. He never forgave, and he never forgot. That night, a real darkness fell over the city, and it wasn't just the sky. I learned later that Dominic stood in his office and watched that footage 3 times. His jaw was so tight, he said his teeth ached. He watched me fall, watched them kick me. He watched one of them pocket my Lily's little bracelet and laugh. Something inside that man just broke. He picked up his phone. "Vincent, get the team, now." 20 minutes later, 6 men were standing in his basement. These were his guys, the ones who had been with him through everything, who never asked questions. "Tony Marcello?" Dominic said, his voice flat and cold as a stone. "He runs some loan operation from a warehouse on Holstead. I want him found. Tonight." Vincent asked for his orders. "Don't kill him," Dominic said, and I was told his eyes had a terrible light in them. "But make sure he remembers this night for the rest of his pathetic life. Break what you have to, take back what he stole, and make it perfectly clear that the woman is under my protection." Vincent just gave a single nod. "Consider it done." His team just melted into the night like shadows. They found Marcello's warehouse a little after midnight. 8 men inside playing cards and counting their money, no idea what was about to hit them. The whole thing was over in 4 minutes. Dominic's men were like surgeons, brutal and precise. They shattered kneecaps, cracked ribs. They left Marcello crawling on the filthy concrete, his face a bloody ruin, pleading for his life. Vincent knelt down in front of him and held up a tiny bracelet of pink and purple beads. "This belongs to someone important," he said, his voice calm as anything. "You stole it. That was a mistake." "I didn't know," Marcello choked out. "I didn't know she was connected to—" "Well, now you know." Vincent put the bracelet away. "The debt is gone, completely. If you or any of your men so much as breathe in her direction again, If you even think her name, we will come back. And next time, we won't be so gentle." He just stood up and walked out, leaving that man weeping in his own blood. The next morning, I showed up at the mansion with bruises I just couldn't hide. I'd tried my best with makeup, but you couldn't miss the swelling around my eye or the cut on my lip. Mrs. Crawford saw it right away. Her eyes went wide with worry, but she knew better than to say anything. I went to the playroom to get ready for Lucas's lesson, moving so stiffly. Every breath sent a shooting pain through my ribs. "Miss Morgan?" I turned, and a guard was in the doorway. "Mr. Castellano wants to see you in his study." Oh, my heart just plummeted. What had I done? Was he furious I'd left without permission? I followed the guard down those long hallways, and every step felt like it was made of lead. Dominic was standing by the window when I came in. He turned, and his gaze just swept over my face, taking in every single bruise, every cut. "Close the door," he said, his voice quiet. I did as he said, my hands shaking. Dominic walked across the room until he was right in front of me. He didn't say a word, just reached into his pocket and took out a small velvet box. "Open it." My fingers were trembling so much I could barely lift the lid. Inside, resting on black silk, was Lily's bracelet. Those pink and purple beads, a little scuffed up, but whole. My breath just caught in my chest. "How did you—" And I couldn't even finish the sentence. "No one is allowed to hurt you," Dominic said, his voice so low and fierce. "You are mine now, under my protection. Anyone who touches you will answer to me." Tears just started streaming down my face. I clutched the bracelet to my heart, my whole body shaking with sobs I couldn't hold back anymore. Dominic just stood there for a second, looking so lost. Here was a man who commanded armies and built empires, but he had no idea what to do with a crying woman. Then slowly, almost awkwardly, he reached out and pulled me to his chest. I just collapsed against him, weeping on his shoulder, letting out months of fear and grief. His arms were stiff at first, but then they slowly wrapped around me. His hand came up and started patting my back, so gentle and unsure, like he was holding something fragile. We just stood there like that for what felt like forever. Just two broken people, holding each other up in the quiet. A tiny sound made us both turn. Lucas was standing in the doorway, holding his Mr. Buttons, just watching us with these big, curious eyes. Then, his little hands moved, slowly and with purpose, making the signs I'd taught him. "Ellie sad." It was a question, a whole sentence. The first one he'd ever put together on his own in 8 months. I laughed right through my tears and knelt down to his level. "A little sad," I signed back, "but getting better now." Lucas looked from me to his father, and then his little hands moved again. "Daddy, help!" Dominic's breath hitched. He knelt down beside me, and his own eyes looked misty. "Yes," he signed, his movements a bit clumsy but clear as day. "Daddy, help." After that night, honey, everything changed. It was like a dam had broken inside Lucas. He started communicating more than ever. He wouldn't even wait for me to start our lessons. He'd come find me, tugging on my sleeve, his little hands eager to talk. He started asking for things. Apple, book, outside play. And then he started asking questions. "Why sky blue?" he signed one afternoon, pointing out the window. "Where birds go?" he asked another day, as we watched a flock fly over the house. Every single question felt like a little miracle. Each sign was proof that the little boy who'd been trapped in silence was finally finding his way out. Then came the one question I was never ready for. We were in the playroom, going over emotions. Happy, sad, angry, scared. He was getting them all, his little face copying the feelings as he made the signs. Then he just stopped and looked at me, with an intensity that just stole my breath. "Ellie have child?" he signed so slowly. The whole world just tilted on its axis. My hands froze right where they were. My throat went tight. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Lucas just waited, so patient, watching me with those deep brown eyes that always seemed to see right through you. Finally, I managed to nod. Yes, I signed back, my hands shaky. I had a daughter. Her name was Lily. I took out my phone and found a picture for him. It was Lily at the park, laughing her head off on a swing, her golden curls flying. Lucas leaned in close, studying her picture with this very serious look on his face. Lily. Pretty, he signed. She was beautiful, I agreed, the tears starting to well up. And she was sick, like your mommy was sick. Her heart didn't work right. Lucas looked up at me so sharply. Lily like Lucas? Also no talk? He signed. At the end, yes. She was too weak to speak, but she talked with her hands, just like you do. I managed a small smile through my tears. I taught her signs. Even when she couldn't say the words, she could still tell me she loved me. Lucas took all of this in, very quietly. Then his hands moved one last time. Lily sad? No, baby, I told him. Lily was happy, because she knew her mommy loved her very, very much. A long, quiet moment passed between us. Lucas's little brow was all furrowed, his mind just working so hard to understand it all. It was heartbreaking. Then he signed the words that just shattered me. Mommy, Lucas, leave. Mommy, not love Lucas anymore. And just like that, I understood. The months of silence, the emptiness in his eyes. He didn't think his mother had passed away. He believed she'd abandoned him. No, I signed back firmly, taking his little hands. No, sweetheart. Your mommy did not leave you. She didn't choose to go. She was sick, so very sick. The sickness took her from us. His eyes, honey, they filled with tears he'd held back for 8 long months. But she go leave Lucas, leave Daddy. She didn't want to go. I signed against his little chest so he could feel my words. Your mommy loved you more than anything in this entire world. She wanted to stay. But sometimes, even when we love someone with our whole heart, we can't stay. He buried his face in my shoulder, his little body trembling. Mommy, love, Lucas, he signed without even looking. More than all the stars in the sky. And up in his study, 3 floors above us, Dominic sat frozen, watching it all on a security monitor. As he did every single afternoon, watching his son's progress. But he wasn't ready for this. The thought that Lucas believed Isabella had left him, that his son had spent 8 months thinking his mother chose to go, that he wasn't enough to make her stay. Dominic's hands shook, his vision went blurry. He'd been so lost in his own grief, he never stopped to think about what Lucas was feeling. He never saw the poison that had been growing in his boy's mind. My fault, he whispered to the quiet room. This is all my fault. He just put his face in his hands and cried. That night, long after the mansion was still, Dominic crept into Lucas's room. The boy was lying in bed, Mr. Buttons tucked under his chin, his eyes closed but not really asleep. The nightlight cast soft shadows on his sweet face. Dominic knelt right by the bed. Slowly, so carefully, he started to sign. Daddy, love, Lucas. The boy's eyes fluttered open. Mommy, love, Lucas, Dominic continued, his hands a little clumsy but so determined. Mommy, not leave. Mommy, always here. He pressed his hand to Lucas's chest, right over his heart. Lucas just stared at his dad, there in the half-light. And then, for the first time in 8 months, he reached out. His small hand touched Dominic's cheek, feeling the tears that were right there on his father's face. That touch, it said more than words ever could. After that night, things began to change in the most wonderful way. Dinner wasn't a silent, lonely meal anymore. Every evening, the 3 of us would gather at the kitchen table, not in that big, formal dining room, but in the cozy heart of the house where Isabella once showed Lucas how to make pancakes. Lucas sat right between Dominic and me, his little hands always moving. He was constantly signing, asking questions, sharing all the thoughts that had been locked away for 8 long months. Food good? He'd sign to the cook, who would just smile, not understanding a word. Daddy tired, he'd point out one evening. Ellie, pretty, he signed another night, which made me blush and Dominic clear his throat. That huge house began to feel less like a museum and more like a real home. And then came the laughter. It was a Tuesday evening. I was trying to teach Lucas a new sign during our meal. It was about animals. I got all mixed up, confusing the signs for horse and duck, and ended up making this bizarre gesture that looked absolutely silly. Lucas just stared at my hands, his brow furrowed. Then, his lips twitched. A tiny little sound escaped. A small giggle. You could barely hear it. I froze. Dominic stopped breathing. Lucas looked between us, saw our shocked faces, and suddenly just burst out laughing. A full, real laugh. That sound filled the kitchen like sunshine after a storm. 8 months of silence, just broken by pure joy. My eyes filled with tears. Dominic found my hand under the table and squeezed it so hard it almost hurt. None of us moved, like we were afraid to break the spell. Lucas laughed until he was out of breath, signing Ellie silly again and again. It was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. Catherine came to visit that next weekend. She probably expected to find that same empty mansion, that same quiet child. Instead, she found Lucas running through the halls with Mr. Buttons bouncing in his arms, signing away at me as I playfully chased after him. The boy was laughing. Catherine stood frozen right there in the foyer, just watching her grandson smile. Grandmother, Lucas signed when he saw her, running over to take her hand. Ellie, teach. Lucas, talk now with hands. He showed off a few signs, his face shining with pride. Catherine looked at me then, and I couldn't quite read her expression. That coldness was still there, of course, but something else flickered in her eyes. Perhaps, she said very slowly, you have something the specialist did not. It wasn't an apology, not really, but coming from Catherine Castellano, it was basically a love letter. By the end of the month, I'd officially moved into the mansion. For Lucas, of course, Dominic told anyone who asked. No one really believed him. My room was put next to Lucas's, with a connecting door that we never locked. I read him stories at night, signing along with the words on the page. I was there when he woke up from bad dreams, there when he needed comfort, or when he just wanted company. And I was there for Dominic, too. It was in the small moments, like snowflakes building up. Dominic putting a blanket over me when I'd fallen asleep grading Lucas's drawings. Me straightening his tie, my fingers staying just a moment too long. Our hands brushing when we both reached for the same thing, neither of us pulling away. Vincent noticed the change in his boss. First time in 8 months I have seen him smile, he murmured to Mrs. Crawford one afternoon. Mrs. Crawford allowed herself a little smile. It is not just because of the boy. No, Vincent agreed. It is not. One night, Lucas woke up screaming. No sound came out, but his mouth was open wide, his body fighting invisible things. His hands clawed at the sheets, signing broken words that made no sense. I burst through the connecting door first. Dominic was seconds behind me. We reached Lucas at the same time, gathering him up between us. I remember holding him so tight that night, his little body finally stopped trembling as the silent screams turned into quiet tears. Your father and I just kept signing the same things against him. Safe. You're safe. We're here. In all that chaos, our hands somehow found each other over his sleeping back. We just held on, as if letting go would shatter everything all over again. We didn't speak or move for the longest time. A month after that awful night brought us all together, your father found me in the library. Walk with me, he said, his voice low. I need to talk to you. You were already fast asleep. Mr. Buttons clutched under your chin, the soft glow of the nightlight on your face. It was the first time in what felt like forever that you'd gone to bed so peacefully. I followed him out the back doors. We went into the garden. It was one of those perfect, still Chicago nights. You could see the stars scattered across the sky like spilled sugar, with the city glowing way off in the distance. But right there, it felt like our own private world. We walked for a bit before sitting on an old stone bench. For a while, we just sat. Isabella loved this garden, your dad finally said, his voice just a whisper. She planted most of this. She used to say our world had enough darkness, and she wanted something beautiful to come home to. I just listened, my hands folded in my lap. When I met her, he said, I was already so deep in this life. Blood on my hands, you know? Enemies everywhere. I figured I was a lost cause. He looked up at the stars. But she saw something else in me, like underneath it all, there was a man worth loving. She changed you, I said very quietly. She was the only light I had. His voice broke a little. I swore I'd protect her. I built this entire world for her. I would have burned down anything that threatened her, but in the end, the threat was something inside her own body, her heart. He let out this bitter little laugh. I've broken men with my own two hands. I've destroyed entire organizations, but I couldn't save my own wife. The pain in his voice was so raw, so real. I just reached out and put my hand on his. I understand, I told him. More than you know. He looked at me, waiting. Marcus was so charming when I first met him. I started, my own voice surprisingly steady. He made me feel like I mattered. After growing up feeling invisible, bouncing between foster homes, here was someone who said he loved me. My hand tightened on his. The abuse didn't start until after Lily was born. Little things, you know, a push, a slap, and he was always so sorry afterward, always promised it would never happen again. I had to swallow hard. And I believed him, every single time. Why did you stay? He asked. Because I thought I deserved it, I whispered, the tears starting to fall. Because I thought that's what love was supposed to feel like, and because I had nowhere else to go. Your father's jaw was set like stone. When Lily got sick, he gambled away everything. All the money I had saved for her surgery just gone. And when she died, while I was holding my little girl in that cold hospital room, he ran. He just left me there with all the debt and all the grief. The silence between us was so heavy with all that shared sadness. You deserved better, your father said, his voice fierce. You deserve so much more than you were ever given. So do you, I managed to say, looking him right in the eye. Isabella would want you to be happy. She wouldn't want you to just drown in all this guilt. How can you know that? Because if my Lily could see me suffering, it would break her heart, I said, even smiling a little through my tears. The people we love want us to live, especially when they can't be here with us. He turned to face me then. He raised his hand and cupped my cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a tear. That announcement I made, he said slowly, about marrying whoever helped Lucas speak. I intend to honor it, but not out of some obligation. My breath just hitched in my throat, not because of a promise I made when I was desperate, he went on, his voice getting softer, but because He couldn't finish. I didn't come here for your money, I whispered. I came here for Lucas. But now, I found myself leaning into his hand. Now I'm staying for both of you. His eyes were just searching mine. He gently tilted my chin up, and he leaned closer until I could feel his breath. Our lips were just about to touch, and that's when we heard it. A sound that shattered the whole world. A tiny, hoarse voice, rusty from 8 long months of not being used. Daddy. We both froze solid. Then we heard it again, a little stronger this time, ringing through the quiet night. Daddy. Your father was on his feet before he even knew what he was doing. I was running right beside him, and our hearts were just hammering away together. That voice. It was your voice. Your dad and I burst through the doors, our hearts pounding. That huge foyer stretched out in front of us, the marble floors shining under all those fancy lights. And there you were, standing at the very top of that big, curving staircase. Mr. Buttons was dangling from your hand. You had tears rolling down your cheeks, catching the light. Your little chest was heaving, and you were trembling from head to toe. Daddy! The word was so scratchy, like an old rusty hinge. But it was you. It was really your voice. Your father just stopped dead at the bottom of the stairs. 8 months, 243 days, thousands of hours of absolute silence. We'd seen so many doctors and therapists, and they all said there was nothing to be done. And now, on a perfectly ordinary night, you were speaking. Daddy, don't! You were holding onto the banister so tightly your knuckles were white. Every single word was a struggle, pulled from a throat that had forgotten its job. Don't leave, Lucas. Those words hit your father like a physical blow. He flew up those stairs. I swear I've never seen anyone move so fast. He almost tripped. He was in such a hurry to get to you. He just fell to his knees right in front of you and pulled you into his arms, holding you so tight I thought you might break. Never, he choked out, the tears just streaming down his face. I will never leave you. Never. Do you hear me? You were clinging to his neck, your little body shaking with sobs. But in between the tears, the words just kept coming. Lucas scared, you said, your little hands signing against his chest even as you spoke. Daddy also leave like Mommy. Your father pulled back just enough to hold your face in his hands, making you look at him. Why? He asked, and his voice was completely broken. Why would you think Daddy would leave? Your little lip trembled. Your hands were still moving while you talked, as if you were speaking 2 languages at once. Daddy's sad all the time. Your voice cracked. Daddy cry at night. Maybe Daddy won't go to Mommy. Leave Lucas alone. Oh, honey, the look on your father's face. It was like he'd been struck by lightning. All those nights he thought he was hiding his grief from you, falling apart behind closed doors where he thought you couldn't see or understand. You had seen it all. And in your sweet little boy's mind, you thought his sadness meant he wanted to leave you forever to be with your mother. No, your father said fiercely, his own tears making paths down his cheeks. No, son. I was sad because I miss Mommy, because my heart hurts so much when I think of her. But I would never, ever leave you, he signed and spoke at the same time, his hands a little clumsy but his meaning crystal clear. You are my whole world, Lucas. Mommy is gone, but you are right here, and I will stay with you forever. You just buried your face in his chest, your small shoulders shaking. Promise, you whispered, the sound muffled by his shirt. Promise, he said, and kissed the top of your head. I promise on my life. They just held each other like that for a long time at the top of the stairs. A father and a son, both so broken, but both starting to heal. Then you lifted your head, and your eyes found me. I was still standing at the bottom of the staircase with my hand over my mouth, crying my eyes out. Ellie, you said, your voice still a little rough but getting stronger. Ellie, also stay, right? My breath just caught. Your dad turned and looked at me, his eyes all red and raw. He didn't say a word, but I could see he was asking the exact same question. Both of my boys, waiting for an answer. I walked up those stairs so slowly, each step feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. When I got to you both, I knelt down and took your tiny hand in mine. Do you want me to stay? I asked you softly. You nodded so hard, I thought your little head might pop off. Ellie is family. That word, family. It just hung there in the air. You were the first one to say it, after 8 long months of silence. And you weren't talking about blood. You were talking about choice. You were talking about love. My tears started all over again. Then I will stay, I whispered back. As long as you want me. Lucas threw his little arms around my neck, pulling me into a hug with his father. The three of us knelt there at the top of that grand staircase, all tangled up in each other's arms, crying and laughing all at once. Dominic's hand found mine, our fingers locking together, and in that moment, something new was born. Something so fragile and precious. A family, not of blood, but of broken hearts choosing to heal side by side. News that Lucas was speaking traveled fast. Soon, the whole city was whispering about it. The Castellano boy had spoken. The impossible had happened. The Iron Fist's wild gamble paid off. But it wasn't a specialist who'd worked the miracle. It was a cleaning woman, a nobody from the South Side. The stories spread like crazy. Catherine arrived at the mansion 3 days after our night on the stairs. She found Lucas in the playroom, chattering away in his mix of words and signs, showing me his drawings with so much excitement. The boy who had been a ghost was now just radiating so much light. Catherine stood in the doorway just watching. When I finally noticed her, I braced myself for that familiar chill. Instead, Catherine crossed the room and pulled me into a hug. "I was wrong about you," the older woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "Forgive me and thank you." I was so frozen, I didn't know how to respond. Before I could say anything, she pulled back, dabbed at her eyes, and turned to her grandson, as if it was nothing. But everything had changed. Dr. Hayes came the next week to evaluate Lucas's progress. He spent 2 hours with the boy, running tests, observing, and scribbling furious notes. "This is a medical miracle," he declared afterward, shaking his head in disbelief. "I have never seen anything like it. The psychological breakthrough, the alternative communication. It shouldn't have worked, but it did." He looked at me with a new kind of respect. "Whatever you did, Miss Morgan, you achieved what the entire medical establishment could not." But I knew the truth. It hadn't been a miracle. A miracle. I had just seen a little boy who was as broken as I was. A week later, Dominic took me somewhere completely unexpected. A cemetery on a hill that looked out over Chicago. It was so peaceful and green, even with the gray sky. We walked without a word past all the headstones until we came to one that was set a little apart. Isabella Marie Castellano, beloved wife, devoted mother, forever in our hearts. There were fresh flowers at the base, white roses. "I come here every week," Dominic said, his voice so soft. "Sometimes more often." I knelt down by the grave, my heart just aching for them. "You were a good person," I whispered to the stone. "I'm so sorry I ever hated you. You tried to help my daughter. You cried for her when I couldn't afford to save her." Tears started rolling down my face. The world failed both of us. Not you. Never you. I put my hand on the cold marble. "I'll take care of them now. Your husband and your son. I will love them with my whole heart." My voice cracked. "Please rest easy." Dominic knelt down next to me, his shoulder just brushing against mine. "I found her journal," he said quietly. "The road. My old promise still stands," he told me, keeping his eyes on what was ahead. "I told everyone I'd marry whoever got Lucas to speak." My heart just about beat out of my chest. "But I don't want you to say yes because you feel like you have to." He finally glanced over at me, and his gaze was so intense, so tender. He started to say, "I want you to say yes because—" But he couldn't get the words out. He never finished that thought, but looking at him then, I didn't need him to. About a week after our visit to the cemetery, Dominic took me to a part of the house I'd never been to before. We went down some hidden stairs behind the library, through a long hall filled with old family portraits, and stopped at this huge iron-banded oak door. "Where are we?" I asked him, a little nervous. He didn't say a word, just opened it. I think my jaw dropped. It was this incredible, grand, circular room with high ceilings and walls covered in dark velvet. A massive table sat in the middle, with a circle of empty chairs around it. This, I realized, was where the city's underbelly met, where deals were made and enemies were taken care of. But that night, it looked completely different. There were hundreds of candles lighting up the entire room, making shadows dance on the walls. All the chairs were gone. The table was empty except for a single piece of paper right in the center. Dominic went over to the table and picked it up. "This is where I made that promise," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet. "Right here, in front of everyone. I swore I'd give half of my entire world to the person who could help my son talk again." I just stood there watching him, my heart hammering. I was a desperate man that night, completely broken. I would have said anything. He looked down at the paper he was holding. "This is the original. Signed, witnessed, all legally official." Then, he pulled a lighter from his pocket. The little flame touched the corner of the paper. It crept across the page, eating up all those words that were born from desperation and grief. Dominic let the burning contract drift down into a metal bowl, where it just turned to ash. "I don't need this anymore," he said so softly. My eyes started to well up in the candlelight. "I never wanted any of your empire," I whispered, "or your money, or any of that." "I know." He turned to me then. "That's precisely why I had to burn it." He reached inside his coat and pulled out a little velvet box. "And then, my dear," he went down on one knee. I completely forgot how to breathe. "Eleanor Morgan," he began, his voice shaking just a bit. "I'm not on this knee to keep a promise. This isn't about obligation or gratitude or some kind of debt." He opened the box, and inside, a single simple diamond ring just drank up the candlelight, glittering like a tiny star. "I'm doing this because somewhere between the day you first walked into this house and right now, I fell completely in love with you." Tears were just rolling down my face. "You saved my son," he went on, "but you saved me too. You taught me that sorrow doesn't have to be the end of the story, that a broken heart can actually learn how to beat again." His hands were trembling as he held the ring out. "I'm asking you to let me love you, to let us build a family together with Lucas, to let me spend my whole life showing you that you deserve all the happiness in the world." He took a deep breath. "Eleanor Morgan, will you marry me?" For a second, I couldn't even get a word out. The tears kept coming, but my smile felt wider and brighter than all those candles. "Yes," I whispered, and then I said it louder, with a laugh, breaking through it all. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." He slipped the ring right onto my finger. It fit like it was always meant to be there. He stood up and just wrapped me in his arms, and the kiss we shared was everything. It was soft and strong, loving and full of longing, a promise that no piece of paper could ever hold. Just then, we heard the door creak open, and we pulled apart. Little Lucas was standing right there, with Vincent and Mrs. Crawford behind him. His eyes were so big, full of hope and a little worry. "Ellie." "Yes?" he asked, his voice still a bit scratchy, but getting better each day. I laughed through my tears and knelt down to him. "Yes, sweetheart." I said yes. Lucas's face just lit up with the biggest grin I had ever seen. He came running and launched himself at us, almost knocking us over. "Family!" he yelled, and the word was so clear and perfect. "We're a family!" The three of us just hugged right there in the candlelight, a mess of laughter and happy tears. Dominic kissed the top of Lucas's head, holding us both so tight. "Thank you, Isabella," I heard him whisper into the quiet room. "Thank you for sending her to us." 1 month later, the garden was overflowing with white roses. Our wedding was small. No big church, no huge guest list, none of the usual mafia show of power. It was just a simple little ceremony in the garden that Isabella had loved, right under the oak tree where Dominic and I had first truly opened up to each other. We had 30 chairs set up in a half circle for our closest friends, our most trusted people, and the loyal staff. Vincent was standing by Dominic's side, looking a little stiff in his suit. Mrs. Crawford was dabbing her eyes with a little handkerchief, pretending it was just allergies. And then, at the top of the white aisle, it was my turn. I wore a simple ivory gown that moved like water when the breeze blew. I didn't have a veil or fancy jewelry, just Lily's bracelet and a little crown of white roses in my hair. I don't think I'd ever felt more beautiful. Catherine came up to me before I reached the front. She was holding this beautiful antique tiara made of delicate silver and tiny diamonds. "This was Dominic's grandmother's," she said, her voice clear, but her eyes were shining. "Every Castellano bride has worn it for 4 generations." She gently placed it in my hair, on my head. "Welcome to the family," she whispered, and I remember thinking, it's real. My eyes just welled up, and I didn't even try to stop the tears. Then came Lucas, walking down the aisle with our rings on a little pillow. He looked so sure of himself, a huge smile, bright eyes, and Mr. Buttons tucked right under his arm. Some things were just too important to leave behind. When he got to the front, he looked right at his dad and signed, "I did good." And Dominic, your grandfather, he signed back, "Perfect, absolutely perfect." The ceremony itself was short, but it felt like a lifetime of meaning packed into a few minutes. Dominic held my hands, and I could hear the catch in his voice. He told me he thought his heart had closed forever after Isabella, that all he'd ever feel again was anger and loss. But then he said I'd brought light back into their world, given his son a voice, and given him a reason to hope. I squeezed his hands, my own tears falling. I told him I never believed I was worthy of love. I truly thought I was too broken to ever be fixed, that happiness was for other people. But he showed me that wasn't true, that even deep scars can heal, and that broken hearts can find their way back together, that even the saddest stories can have a happy ending. We turned to our little group of guests, and I think we said it at the same time. "We'll prove everyone wrong together." We exchanged the rings and said our vows, and when Dominic kissed me, the whole garden seemed to cheer. But the moment that truly changed my world came right after. Lucas came up and tugged on my dress. I knelt down to him, and he put his sweet little hands on my face. "I love Daddy," he said, so clearly, his voice stronger than I'd ever heard. "And I love Mommy." Ellie. Hearing that word Mommy, it was like a tidal wave of every feeling I thought I'd lost. I never ever thought I'd hear it again. "Oh, my sweet boy," I just sobbed and pulled him into the biggest hug. "I love you too, so much." Your grandfather wrapped his arms around both of us, and I could feel his tears on my hair. At that moment, it was like I could almost see Lily, laughing on a swing, her golden hair flying. And Dominic told me later he saw Isabella, smiling in that same garden, her hands covered in dirt from her roses, her eyes full of love. It felt like they were both giving us their blessing, giving us their peace. Later on that night, after everyone had gone home, the three of us were sitting in Lucas's room. He was chattering away, a mile a minute, mixing his words and his signs so naturally, showing me all his drawings from the day. Then Dominic reached into his pocket. "Lily's bracelet," he said, his voice so gentle. "I had it cleaned." He took my hand. "I want you to have it, so she's always with you." He fastened it on my wrist, right next to my new wedding band. That's when I really let go, just burying my face in his chest. "Thank you," was all I could manage to say. "For everything." We just held each other while Lucas kept on with his stories, not realizing the weight of that moment. Then he stopped all of a sudden. "Daddy?" he asked, tilting his head. "Yes, son? Can I have a baby brother?" Your grandfather and I just looked at each other, and all that emotion just turned into laughter. "We'll certainly try our best, sweetheart," I said, wiping my eyes. "We will definitely try." A year after the wedding, you wouldn't have even recognized our lives. I remember standing on the rooftop terrace, my hand resting on my big belly. I was 6 months along, and you were kicking up a storm, especially every time Lucas would press his ear against my stomach. "Baby, this is Lucas," he'd announce for what felt like the 100th time that week. I'm your big brother. I'm going to teach you how to sign, and I'll share Mr. Buttons with you, but just sometimes. I'd laugh and run my fingers through his hair. Lucas had just blossomed. He was in a regular kindergarten, had 3 best friends, and he never stopped talking. It was this beautiful mix of speaking and signing that was all his own. Mr. Buttons still had his spot on the nightstand, watching over him, but he didn't need to clutch him all night anymore. He finally slept soundly, knowing he was loved and safe, and that we were never going to leave. Dominic had changed too. He'd stepped away from the more complicated parts of his business, leaving things to people he trusted. His enemies, well, they still knew who he was, but his focus was completely different. His family was everything. The rest was just noise. His greatest source of pride became the foundation. He launched the Isabella and Lily Foundation 6 months after we were married, to help children with congenital heart defects whose families couldn't afford the care. Every single child they helped was a way of honoring the 2 beautiful souls we'd lost, and a promise that no other mother would feel the way I had in that hospital. I remember one night, the 3 of us were lying on blankets on the rooftop, just watching the stars come out. "Mommy," Lucas asked, pointing up. "Yes, sweetheart?" "Mommy Isabella and Sister Lily are up there, right?" My heart just ached with so much love. "Yes, baby. They're always watching over us, and they're happy." He turned to his father then. "Because we're happy." Dominic pulled him in close, his voice thick. "Yes, they're very happy. Because we all found each other and became a family." Lucas thought about that for a second. Then he sat right up and raised his little hands to the sky. "I love you all," he signed to the stars, his movement so clear and sure. I joined him, my hands moving with his. Then Dominic did too, still a little clumsy with his signs back then, but so full of heart. 3 sets of hands, sending love up to the heavens. After that, a quiet settled over us. But it wasn't a sad quiet, not the empty kind. It was a peaceful silence, a full silence. I looked at your grandfather, then at my stepson, then down at my belly where new life was growing. I thought about everything that had brought me to that rooftop, the foster homes, the abuse, my first failed marriage, losing Lily, all those nights I wanted to give up, and then the silly job application that led me to that house, to that man, and to that little broken boy who ended up healing me. "Sometimes," I whispered, "the deepest wounds lead us to the greatest love." Dominic heard me. He reached over Lucas's sleeping body and took my hand. "I used to think that night was the worst night of my life," he said softly, talking about the night he'd made that crazy announcement. "I thought it was the moment I finally shattered completely." He lifted my hand and kissed it. But it was actually the night my life was saved. I just didn't know it yet. By then, Lucas was fast asleep between us, his breathing so soft and even in the starlight. Your grandfather and I just looked at each other over his head, no words needed. Our hands found each other in the dark and just held on. And up above us, 2 stars seemed to shine brighter than all the others, almost like they were twinkling down and smiling. You see, sweetheart, that's what our story taught me. That sometimes, even after the worst things happen, you can find the greatest love. It taught me that loss shows you how to truly treasure what you have. And it showed me that family isn't always about blood. It's about hearts that find each other and decide to hold on. Always remember that when words aren't enough, love always, always finds a way to speak. Our little family is proof of that. And every chapter since that night has just been another beautiful verse in our song. We wish for you to always have good health and peace in your own life. May you find your own moments of joy and connection every single day. I'm so grateful I could share this with you. It's a story worth telling, don't you think? Now, how about we go get another cup of tea before it gets too late? This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.